about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro, and welcome back to Front of Mind Season 1, the series where we grab ourselves a guest from this broader water-sensitive urban design, stormwater industry, low-impact design industry, given that our guest is American today, and we sit down for a chat about what is interesting them, fascinating them, possibly puzzling them at the moment. Our guest today is Blair Scott. Now, Blair is a water quality planner from King County in America. So King County is the county that surrounds the city of Seattle. Blair and I first met, 5-6 years ago, Blair? When you were at...
Longer than that, Jack. Way longer than that.
I don't think so. I think we met in early 2012. And it's now 20...
more like 2010.
Okay. We'll see. We've already started this episode on an argument of how long we've known each other. But regardless, we met when you were out here in Australia doing your Masters of Integrated Water Management. You were doing that closely related with Healthy Waterways at the time, and then I ended up working for Healthy Waterways, and we hung out and spent time together and had lots of good discussions. So Blair, welcome along.
Thank you.
So when I reached out to you the other day, I was like, look, doing this series, it's called Front of Mind. I've been recording these episodes for a couple of years. It would be really great to finally get you on. And I asked you, look, what is front of mind for you at the moment? And you came back quite clearly with the concept of working across jurisdictional boundaries. So that's the concept we're going to dig into. Can I ask you to start this conversation by just painting us a picture? So obviously you're working in stormwater world in the Seattle region, in the King County region. Can you paint us a picture, when you say working across jurisdictional boundaries, paint us a picture of what that means, and then from there we can dig into probably some of the more interesting stuff, which is actually the how and the why that's important.
Sure, yeah. So working across jurisdictional boundaries is sort of, at least in my mind, seen as the holy grail of stormwater management. And that's really for two primary reasons. It's because I personally, in the world I work in, see that as a way to prioritize actions and get the biggest bang for buck and largest environmental lift in a particular watershed or catchment, as you call it. And also, it's a way of sharing the financial burden among multiple jurisdictions within a watershed, because we don't have infinite money, right? And so to give some context or background to why that's important to the work I do. So in the US, a lot of the stormwater management actions that are driven by regulation, at least, are jurisdictionally based, and jurisdictions, or like councils, as you would call them in Australia, are obviously not based on watershed boundaries. And so back in the 70s in the US, there was extreme issues with pollutants. There was waterways catching on fire. It was terrible, and we realized stormwater is a really big issue. So they passed what's called the Clean Water Act, and in that, there's a program called the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or referred to as NPDES or NIPDES. And under this program, communities with a certain population have the municipal stormwater permits, which requires that they do many actions, stormwater management actions, in order to discharge to natural waters. And so most of what stormwater managers do in the U.S. are based on jurisdictional boundaries. They can only do legally, based on their codes that they build, can only do what's within their jurisdiction. And this has become a big issue because each jurisdiction only has a certain amount of money, and we prioritize based on what's right for our jurisdiction, not what's right for the particular watershed, and that only gets us so far.
Gotcha. Okay. So in the context here, in the Seattle region, what are the particular water bodies or waterways that you guys would be seeking to protect? Just so we can put some names to this.
Well, one of the areas that we're trying to do this currently, and that's because it's such a high-profile water body, is the river that empties out right into Puget Sound, which is downtown Seattle, and it's called the Duwamish River.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Green Duwamish watershed is the waterway that empties out right into Puget Sound, right in downtown Seattle, and it's heavily urbanized and industrial at the mouth. And just like most urban watersheds, as you get further up into the catchment, it's more rural, more agriculture.
And how many different jurisdictions have a role to play in that? So for the Brisbane River, I'm just thinking, in my context, we go up through, it's probably 5 or 6. Is that that in the ballpark, or?
I think it's more like 10 to 12 in that watershed, I believe.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's probably, for an Australian audience, it's probably more akin to if you're talking about Victoria or somewhere where we've got some smaller local governments and the like, and I could conceivably see how quite a large number of jurisdictions would drain in, whereas for Southeast Queensland, I'm guessing it's probably pretty rare to have that many, although we do have a few. Okay. So you mentioned, so prioritisation has been at the heart of this. You've mentioned that a couple of times as we've gone in as being kind of one of the holy grails. Like, if we can work across these boundaries, it will allow us to prioritise. Can you talk to that point a little bit more?
Yeah, the reason prioritization is so important to me is because a lot of the studies that we've been doing, trying to figure out how we can do stormwater management better, have showed us that if we monitor receiving water quality over long periods of time, we can see, okay, we're doing pretty good. Population's growing and growing, but we're able to sort of hold the line, is the concept tossed around, in that we're able to prevent further environmental degradation in the face of population growth. And that's based on what's required in these ever-evolving municipal stormwater permits, which are reissued every 5 years. So we're always working to try to improve them and learn best practices and incorporate new technologies and so forth. And so we're holding the line, right? But we're not restoring water bodies, and we're not working our way back towards these pre-development standards or forested conditions, is the terminology thrown around in the U.S. And we've also seen from some of these studies that it's extremely expensive. If we were to restore natural hydrology just using stormwater technology, it's billions and billions of dollars for the Puget Sound area. So, in other words, we need to start prioritizing and learn how we can make our dollars go further and use them on what's best for a particular watershed.
Gotcha. And so at the moment, where there's imperfect work across jurisdictional boundaries, people are likely to prioritize, literally, I imagine, say if we just had 2 local governments or 2 jurisdictions here, each of them would have their own budget, each of them would have their own list of actions they could actually do, and so therefore they prioritise and knock off the ones that were highest priority within their area.
Yep.
But it doesn't necessarily mean, which could lead to a couple of problems. If all the most effective actions were in one jurisdiction, but another jurisdiction had a lot more funding, that would obviously cause some problems because you couldn't potentially get the money to the right spot. But it could also cause problems if any of the actions actually literally cross boundaries, because those actions, if they were high priority, might not get done because they just couldn't happen on both sides of the boundary. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, but this has been done in other environmental protection and restoration fields in the U.S. an example that comes to mind is salmon recovery.
Okay.
And with salmon recovery, they have legal agreements between jurisdictions on a watershed scale because they're held to legislation under the Endangered Species Act, because Chinook salmon in Washington State is an endangered species, and so they're required to take action to restore habitat effectively for these salmon. And so they have a prioritized list of aquatic aquatic restoration efforts or projects that they do on a watershed scale, and jurisdictions agree to that prioritized list, and they pay into a bucket of money that helps them work down that list. And largely they're using that scientifically backed prioritization framework to go after grants and to make an argument that they know what's best for the watershed and how to make the money go further. And so people feel good about putting money behind that.
So that's interesting. So in that situation, they've got some, the jurisdictions are paying in some core amount of funding, but then they're supplementing it with grants and the like. Is that fair? So that
exactly. So they sort of pay in to keep the organization going.
Yep.
Like there's the the meetings and the scientific work to keep the organization going, and then they work together and develop a prioritized list that helps them bring in grant revenue.
Yeah, well, so that suddenly caught my attention, because what that reminded me of is one of the local governments in Australia who I've felt is doing one of the better jobs at building good quality stormwater treatment infrastructure is Blue Mountains City Council. And one of the things that's allowed them to be successful, now this isn't a cross-jurisdictional example, but it has some similarities in the way they're using the money, is that they essentially have a core budget that comes every year for stormwater management, but it's not particularly large. But the person who is responsible for that then sets themselves a goal of, I hope I get this right, I can't remember whether it's doubling or tripling that money every year through grant funding, and then that gets them to so that's the first I feel like key pillar towards Blue Mountains getting good assets on the ground. But what it then allows them to do is they've got a critical mass of funding then that they go out and build small, carefully placed treatment systems on a regular basis, which has also allowed their teams to skill up and create more ability, more internal capacity to go out and cost effectively do work. So they've ended up with this neat little cycle where they got some money, which allowed them to get more money, that allowed them to do stuff regularly, so they got better at doing stuff cheaper, which means they can do more the next year round. And it's a neat little feedback loop. And so I can see a similarity there in what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so that's sort of why it's the holy grail is the term I'm using for stormwater management, at least in the U.S., I would say, or in the Northwest where I work, and because it's if we're really going to be having pre-development conditions be our end goal, then there's not enough money to do that effectively, or at least under our current approach.
Yeah, well, so there's I'm torn which way to take this. Now, I've got two questions I want to ask you, so I want to make sure we get to both of them. Can we first go down the route of, so you said it's the holy grail, getting this cross-jurisdictional boundary is the holy grail, and there's already a model for it in salmon recovery.
Yep.
Why do you feel it hasn't happened yet for stormwater management?
Well, there's a number of reasons, I'd say. One being that there are varying levels of size of jurisdiction and thus financial backing and the decisions that are necessary to make something like that work. So we have King County, which is, the 13th, I think, still largest county in the nation, and in that we have some really small rural communities that are, in some cases, to make it even more complex, there's 2 phases of the municipal stormwater permit I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And in phase 1, which was the first permits that were rolled out, those are the larger jurisdictions, and then phase 2 took issued permits for the smaller jurisdictions, so that they at least have to do some things, but they have to do far less than what the phase 1 jurisdictions do in terms of stormwater management.
Right.
So these smaller jurisdictions are going to say, oh, well, I'm only required by law to do A, B, and C, so you're asking me to do A, B, C, D, E, and F? We don't have the money for this. And so, unless you did have a model like sand recovery, where you had, a prioritized list, and you use that for leveraging grant funding, which is not infinite, as we all know, I just don't think that there's the political will to buy into something like that under the current regulatory framework.
It's funny. So that's interesting. As you've explained that, it sounds analogous to something in the way our stormwater objectives work in Australia. Now, it's an analogy. It's not an exact replication, but I'll see if I can explain what I'm thinking here. So essentially, you've described a situation where you have jurisdictions of different sizes, and some of them were in the phase 1 and got certain requirements placed upon them, and then some of them were in phase 2 that are smaller local jurisdictions, and they now have requirements placed upon them, but they're less stringent. So effectively, you have, in Australian terminology, a threshold there. Above a certain size, you're doing this. Below a certain size, you're doing that. That's very similar to the way our stormwater treatment objectives work in Australia, in the sense, now while this isn't applied to a jurisdiction, in Australia we're talking about this being applied to a development. So what it says is, if a development is above 2,500 square metres, this is particularly the case for Queensland, above 2,500 square metres and roughly 6 new lots, and there's a little bit more nuance to that, then you have to meet stormwater treatment objectives. But if you're below that size, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so what has happened over time is, that made sense in the first instance, but as our technology is getting better and changing, and particularly as people are starting to think about offsets, so essentially saying, okay, rather than every little development doing something, let's collect some money in a pot and spend it where we think is best. So effectively, we're talking about prioritised spending there. Suddenly, once you've got a situation like that, the threshold doesn't make any sense anymore, because the reason there was a threshold for development sites was it was thought that it was hard for the small development sites to meet the treatment objectives, so they were exempted in the first instance. It sounds like it was thought that it was hard for the small jurisdictions to meet the same standard of stormwater requirements, so they were delayed and then had a lower level of treatment put on them. But fundamentally, what seems to have played out from what you've described in both situations is, in Australia, now that we have a status quo of some development being in, some development being out, even if you get to an offset situation where there's no longer a reason for there to be a threshold, there's still that kind of institutional lock-in of, well, we suddenly need some political... If we're going to change it, we need some political will to change the situation. Even if it actually doesn't make any sense for there to be a threshold anymore, it's still quite a hurdle to get over to get rid of it. And it kind of sounds like the same thing playing out here, where once everyone's used to the smaller authority having, maybe initially a lesser threshold, even if we... it might take something like this, working across jurisdictional boundaries, to make the case for, okay, but if we do this, if we do work across boundaries, maybe then it makes sense for everyone to be on the same playing field, perhaps.
Yeah, actually, offsets is kind of a good example, because it sort of brings to mind, what are we actually aiming for? What's the target we're trying to achieve? Because if it's trying to achieve the most stormwater treatment in your example, then it would make sense for multiple developments to pay into a pot and provide that treatment in the best location, as hypothetical. Whereas just doing, sticking to the regulation and just doing what's required based on size of development may not get you to the same place.
Correct. So this looks like this will segue beautifully into the second question, which is, well, prioritization sound like it's easy to say, but exactly what does that mean? And something that you and I've talked about a little bit before is the end goal really really influences your prioritized outcomes. Can you speak to that a little, particularly around the holding the line versus restoring waterways to great condition?
Yeah, I mean, stormwater management in terms of restoration, as far as regulations are concerned in the states, is largely driven by what we call TMDLs, total maximum daily load, which is a stormwater management plan that you're required to put together if you exceed state water quality standards for a particular pollutant. And what that does is wait until the water body is exceeding that standard for zinc or for sediment, and then you have to take all these actions to try to restore that water body. But it takes lots of money to develop the plan and the science behind it, and then they take forever to implement, and then legally speaking it's really hard to get it off the list of water bodies that are above that threshold. And so it's not getting us to where we want to go. So the idea is to be proactive and say, well, we don't want any water bodies to end up on that list of being above the threshold. So, but setting that standard of how much we do and what is tolerable or palatable for society to maintain some level of environmental health, that's the conversation that's really hard for me to wrap my mind around.
Yeah, and it has such big implications for the actions that you might take. So in a context of work I've done recently, if a particular local government wanted to took the approach of, well, let's just hold the line. We're okay with our current standard of waterway health, but we recognise we've got a lot of new development coming. Let's just take actions to try and not make things any worse than they are. Then that might lead you to a situation that where your prioritization shows you where best to spend your money using currently available technologies. You might essentially go, well, look, these things are the most effective. You need to put them here, here, and here, and that's it. But if you take the same local government and set the goal of restoring much closer to a natural condition, you don't even have to go to natural, but getting a lot further down the track towards a natural condition, suddenly it becomes apparent, and you alluded to this before, that is not cost effective with current technologies. And with that realization, it then says, well, if you want to get to that point, then you can take it one of either two ways. Either you can spend all that money, which if it's not cost effective, that seems pretty silly, or you can invest in trying to develop new and cheaper and more effective technologies. And maybe in the short term you might see some environmental decline. You might not track immediately in the right direction because you're throwing all your money into development, but longer term you're aiming to be able to take leaps and bounds further down that track. And they're fairly profound differences in approach. They're fairly profound differences in political implications. Imagine being the politician that says, it's okay, we're going to let the waterways decline for a bit because we're going to be able to fix it later. Like, that's a fairly strong position to have to take.
It's sort of similar to that feedback loop example you were talking about, how, if you invest in new technologies and your ability to do better stormwater management, then there's going to be a feedback loop into how effective your approach is.
This is true. Yes.
So I don't know. Maybe there is a way to do that, but until you have a science-based approach, whether it's protecting the best watersheds or trying to restore the worst watersheds, I think you would still have to divide up some of that money into that feedback loop of continuing to do better and up your game, if you will.
Yeah, and it seems to me that regardless of where your goal is, from what you've described, working across jurisdictional boundaries using this kind of salmon recovery model is going to be beneficial regardless of which way you go. If you're shooting for great conditioned waterways,
you'll be able to do more with less.
Exactly. Like it doesn't. Yeah, it's better regardless.
Yeah, but I still think that in order to using the salmon recovery model as an example, you would have to have the end goal in mind in order to have that prioritization for people to buy into.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Right.
So that does lead to there potentially being more complications not necessarily. Yeah, this is the yin and yang of all of these things. Like, if you keep things small and within single jurisdictions, you keep simplicity. Because, for example, when you come,
nothing, right?
What's that? Sorry.
It's better than doing nothing.
Yeah, sure. But, so if you keep it with one jurisdiction, it's simpler because you have less competing interests trying to figure out what the end goal is. So you're potentially more likely to settle on an end goal, but you're going to have a harder time hitting the right priority projects. Or, you put in the work, try and get it set up so you can work across jurisdictional boundaries, and maybe that's a little bit tougher to get agreement on what the end goal is. But if you can get it, potentially it's a higher payoff.
Yeah, right.
When you mentioned a couple of minutes ago about how do you pick what the end goal is, because this is a vexed question, but it reminded me as you mentioned that of one way, and it's got some faults, but I've heard it described as being done. And that was, this is an example from Sydney. I can't remember. I think Parramatta River, Anyway, I know that this was, the broad concept was described to me by Carl Tippler, who's an ecologist from New South Wales. And broadly speaking, Carl described an example where for this particular river, I'm going to assume it's the Parramatta River, there several different. Oh, that's right, what it was. Okay, I'm going to get this a little bit imperfect, but hopefully it's good enough to make the point. They picked a whole range of different species, both plants and animals, I think I'm right in saying, that were kind of iconic to the region. So the sorts of things that people would, definitely the things that they'd really notice and recognise, and then some stuff that's also, considered important and good and people might know about or might not. And essentially went out to the community with this list and were like, okay, tell us which of these are your priorities. So, we're talking both, aquatics, plants and animals, but also aquatic and terrestrial plants and animals, like the whole mix. Went to the community and said, okay, tell us of these, which are your priorities? And the community came back, let's say they voted on it, the specifics don't really matter there, came back and they ended up with a prioritised list of like the 5 highest priority species. And then from that, essentially, the scientific consensus sat down and went, okay, if we wanted to deliver those species, to actually make it so those species were able to remain in the area or could be returned to the area, what would we need from our watershed? So, okay, because of that species being there, we'd need this hydrologically, or because of that species of bird being there, we'd need that species of tree, and essentially we're able to construct theoretically what the catchment should be like, and then from that you can go, well, these are the actions we need to take, and it kind of led them towards their prioritization of those actions. And I like that method for a couple of reasons. One, because it asks the community up front, it has some solidarity. It's not just a bunch of experts sitting in a room. It's actually got a bit of, well, the community said they want this, so there's some buy-in from that. But on the flip side, though, the technical detail of how to get it, the experts are contributing to that part. It's got a good mix of the two, which I really like. I'm curious about your thoughts on that sort of process.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good approach for a few reasons. I mean, I mentioned earlier talking about having an end state that society is comfortable with or that's palatable. Yes. And that sort of achieves that because you have something that people bought into, or they have an environmental condition that they've envisioned where they have at least the particular species that they enjoy and the different plants and animals, right? Well,
and it achieves it in a way that's meaningful for people as well, because you could ask a similar question, say, do you want lead in this creek? But that's a little bit intangible for people, because you can't touch and feel, I mean, you can touch and feel lead, but day to day you don't touch and feel lead unless you've got lead paint in your house. Whereas saying a species, showing someone a bird or a turtle or whatever it is tangible for the community to say, that's more important to me than that is. Whereas it's hard to say lead's more important to me than nitrogen or sediment. So I like it for that reason, for sure.
But in order to have that, the species of fish, we'll say, that you love and want to maintain, you have to make sure that you don't have lead going into your system.
Correct. And I would argue that the experts are better placed to then, nitrogen in a waterway is more tangible, I would argue, as a concept for you and me, because we work in this space, than it is for the community. Yeah, the community, I would argue, is best placed to tell us what they want in terms of animals and birds and, how they want to interact with the waterway. But then the technical nuts and bolts of, well, actually, what do we need to deliver from the catchment?
Yeah. It's sort of similar to like the way we use macroinvertebrates for as indicator species.
Yep.
It's a little bit less, I'm sure, scientifically rigorous, obviously, but at least from a community's perspective, it's something they can relate to more easily.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's sort of like indicator species of the health of the system.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And one of the things I remember now is that Carl explained to me was that they were careful to pick species from a wide range of categories. So I could be wrong, but I think there might have even been a macroinvertebrate category, but it might have been something along the lines of like there was a bird category, a fish category, a macroinvertebrates category, a terrestrial riparian dependent animal category. So it kind of picked up, so it was never going to return our highest priority is these 5 species of birds and we don't care about the fish sort of return. It was always going to give a bit of all of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd like to, I don't know if any of that's documented, but I'd like to see that approach. That's because here, talking about salmon recovery, that is absolutely an iconic indicator species that, you need macroinvertebrates for the smaller fish to survive that the salmon eat, right? And so it's higher up the food chain, sort of like the turtles you mentioned. but it still requires those good environmental conditions, just like any other species.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you asked if there was any way people could see this. There is. I'm just trying to find it online right as we speak. I'll keep doing that while we talk in a second. But it's definitely, I'm really confident it's the Parramatta River that's of interest. If people were to Google Parramatta River swimmability, or making the Parramatta River swimmable again, I think you'd be on the right track towards finding it.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, so we've talked around this topic from a few different angles. Is there anywhere from your point of view that we haven't got to, or we've missed, or we've overlooked?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that pretty much covers the background of why working across jurisdictional boundaries on a watershed scale is so important to me, and why it's sort of where my mind goes as a solution to a lot of the problems that I face as a stormwater manager.
Gotcha. Okay, while you've just said that, I've found it. I can give people a link to this.
Nice.
Where they can. So, it's definitely about the Parramatta River. The website is www.ourlivingriver.com.au, and then at the top of the page there's a link and a drop-down menu titled Our Mascots, and so the mascots are these five species that they've picked. And so people get some context here. The first one's powerful owl, so a bird. Then we've got striped marsh frog, which has got an amphibian. Bar-tailed godwit, another bird. It appears to be like a wader. The southern myotis. This looks like it's a bat. And then the eastern long-necked turtle. So you can kind of see the mix of species in there. And presumably, if we were to dig into the website a little bit more, it might even tell us a bit about how they were picked. But that's certainly the website, ourlivingriver.com.au, if people want to know more about that.
Yeah, and so Jack, describing that made me think of another thing too. And it's sort of something we've talked about in the past around the use of today's technologies, right? And it's sort of at least the assumption now, sort of as I described before, this concept of holding the line, that stormwater management technologies have gotten to a point where if we have a pristine watershed and there's development, we have the technologies to mimic natural hydrology and control pollutants enough to where we can develop to a certain level before we just wreck that system.
Yeah, it's technically, this is not currently an issue of it being technically infeasible. It's economically impractical.
Right, and the reason that's so true, at least in the context of King County, is that most of the development happened, in the 80s and 90s when there was no real concern for water quality. It was just about conveyance.
Yes.
And so this concept of prioritization becomes all the more necessary, because really what we're talking about is retrofitting.
Yep. Yeah, this for me, it's probably a reason why some of my thinking's changed and evolved in this space over time, is that earlier on in my career I had a lot more to do with local governments like Logan City Council. So for people not from southeast Queensland, Brisbane is the capital city of Queensland, and Brisbane City Council is one of the largest local governments in the world because it covers so much of that area, but it's surrounded by a few more fringing local governments such as Logan, Ipswich, Redlands, and for the most part Brisbane has kind of reached its city limits and is now infill development, whereas Logan, Ipswich and Redlands, there's still that literal just growth of the city out into what was once rural residential or rural land. And so the story's very different if you look at a local government like Brisbane, where, as you say, it's got to be retrofits, because all the development now is infill. There's not just large tracts of land sitting around the place.
Yep.
And that has certain cost implications and certain challenges. You compare it to somewhere like Logan. Now, obviously, there are areas that would need to be retrofitted if you wanted to restore them to a great condition. But on the flip side, you've also got all these areas that are being developed for the first time, where there are opportunities to protect in the first instance.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where you were going with that before I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, that's a good example of what I'm talking about, because I mean, the assumption is, right, that we have the technology today to manage the impacts of stormwater off impervious surface, right? So we know how to, generally speaking, mimic natural hydrology and trap pollutants and remove them from the system to where, you know, we shouldn't have a lot of large impacts in the system. We shouldn't see this urban stream syndrome in new developments. I mean, that's sort of a question, right? Is that true, first of all? And if that's the case, then really what we're talking about is just focus. Maybe we should be prioritizing our dollars in the urban areas.
Yeah, I wonder...
Because we're required to do a certain amount of stormwater management with today's technology in the developing areas.
Yeah, I wonder to what extent. So I'm just thinking, like, trying to put myself in in the shoes of someone who's been in this industry longer than I have. Yeah, because by the time I joined the industry in like 2010 or so, the reality is that the vast majority of our stormwater treatment technologies that would currently be considered best practice already existed at that point. So I wasn't around to see the development of, say, the first bioretention system or the first wetland. But I have heard people who were around at the time talk about how great that development was, because prior to that, it was essentially considered an intractable problem. Like, prior to that, it was not only economically impractical, it was actually technically infeasible. Like, the concept that you could actually prevent, with all the money in the world, that you could actually prevent urban stream syndrome was, you know, unthinkable at that point. I wonder whether there's something in this as to why we've become I feel like we've become a little bit locked into current technologies. Whether it's a bit of a case of, because for so long, this could be completely wrong, by the way, but because for so long this was a completely intractable problem, that we dived, as soon as we had the sniff of an opportunity to solve it, we dived in, you know, fully clothed into bioretention systems and wetlands and the like.
Right.
I wonder whether the fact that the problem was so intractable in the past has contributed to why we've got, for at least for a period of time, so locked into these current technologies. I wonder whether it's a case of the decision or the realization that in fact we don't have good enough technologies is so tough to make that we're kind of unwilling to make it, because to admit that the current technologies aren't good enough to do it cost effectively is essentially the same as admitting that we can't do it at all. It takes us back to the same position where we're in when this seemed completely intractable, apart from the difference that we now have an inkling as to what it might look like to solve it.
Yeah. Well, and that's what prompted those studies that I mentioned earlier on, trying to model, okay, with today's technology, if we were to completely retrofit this watershed, how much would it take? Like, if we were to take, you know, restore natural conditions effectively, and it was billions and billions of dollars. I mean, it's just the timeline it would take to accomplish something like that, and the political will it would take to invest that much money needed is just unattainable.
You know, there is one other way to approach this that we haven't discussed here, which is... So one way that I've thought about this in the past, or thought about it recently, not really in the past, it's quite new to me, is a concept of complexity in the system. And one of the criticisms that I would have of the way we're currently doing water sensitive urban design or stormwater treatment or low impact design, whatever we want to call it, is it feels to me like it's making the world more complex as we go. It's essentially like, look, we recognise we have a problem and it has some root causes, but rather than fixing the fundamental root causes, we make things more difficult. We add something else on to try and solve it. It's like, it would be akin to if you got a flat tyre on your car and you solved that situation by bolting a fifth wheel on the outside of the flat tyre rather than just replacing the tyre. So
like end of pipe treatment versus source control, right?
Exactly. And so, but I can see to a certain degree this playing out not just in stormwater, but in the whole urban water cycle. So think about this. Yeah, before anyone settles down and developed a city in a point, you've got a natural catchment, and people come along, and the first thing that needs to be dealt with is a water source, is water supply. So yeah, people either dig some wells, or eventually they build a pipeline to deliver water, and you end up with a reticulated water scheme. But you have water supply. So this is going to quickly turn into Rebecca Brown's diagram, right? Which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so people do that, and they're like, okay, sweet, well that's cool, but oh wait, by accident, because we've got a water source and we're able to settle in a city, we now have a lot of wastewater we need to do something with. So, okay, we need either some septic systems, or we need to sewer the city. Okay, sweet. Well, we've just done that, which has allowed more people to settle in the area. So the city gets bigger, and so then we're like, oh wait, hang on. Now we're having all these flooding issues because we've got all these impervious surfaces. And so in every one of those instances, like, the solution to the problem before potentially causes the next problem. So the solution to the flooding is, well, okay, let's go and drain the city really, really quickly. Oh look, that had some environmental implications to us. Let's try and fix that by rehabilitating waterways and building bioretention systems. It feels to me like everything that's been done in the water cycle today keeps adding complexity and cost on top of itself, and that ultimately the solution to this might be an elegant stripping back and starting again that does away with a bunch of that complexity.
Yeah, I mean, where that takes my mind is thinking about how to prevent the problem in the first place.
Yep.
So let's say fish are dying because there's toxins in brake pads, right?
Yep.
And so let's change what we put into brake pads so that solves that solution, rather than building expensive treatment technologies to remove those toxins.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So that type of example, and yeah, that is much more elegant, and I mean, at least at face value, simple, but it takes a lot of work to do source control through legislation like that.
But the other challenge there is that think about this. Answer me this. Stormwater pollution's a problem. Who are the people that are trying to solve stormwater pollution?
I mean, stormwater managers, because they're driven by regulation and they get a paycheck.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
In reality, but really it should be, the communities that live and enjoy these environments in these communities.
So this brings to mind, I think, a very real problem. Like, if we wanted to, say, have solutions like the brake pad solution you're talking about, it brings to mind, there's a saying along the lines of, like, when the only tool you have is a hammer, the whole world is a nail, or something like that. which could equally be applied to when your degree is in stormwater management, all the solutions to stormwater problems you'll see will involve managing stormwater. Whereas what you described there with quite succinctly and nicely with the brake pad scenario solves the stormwater problem in a way that has nothing to do with stormwater at all.
You need to have a legislator.
Yeah, arguably, we as stormwater people are about pretty close to the worst placed people in the world to try and implement that solution.
Yeah.
So maybe something at the heart of this is how do we connect we as the people who know and recognise stormwater as a problem with the people who actually have a chance to solve it? Because I have literally no idea how to re-engineer a car brake pad.
Interesting. So I'm connecting some ideas we talked about earlier and bringing it back to this. So looking at the concept you described where you have certain species that you recognize as important to the community, and looking at the concept of and importance of prioritization on a watershed scale. So instead of prioritizing stormwater management actions, which are sort of end of pipe and just what stormwater managers know, if you prioritized the problems, let's say, that are causing loss of these species that are important to the community, then you could prioritize that and have a framework that allows for managers or for decision makers other than stormwater managers to weigh in on the best solutions to those problems.
Yeah, or alternatively, so similar to that but slightly different, is instead of prioritising the current technologies or current approaches to mitigate these things, or mitigate these impacts, is to prioritise, is as you say first, to prioritise which of the causes is most important, but then to prioritise which of the actions that a stormwater manager could take to make the right person to solve it go and solve it. So it's like, I mean, this quickly turns into like, how do we set up economic incentives, or how do we ban things, so essentially going, how do we prioritise all the actions that don't involve building a stormwater treatment system? Because if I wanted to solve the car brake pad issue, one way that you could do that, you could run, this would work. You could run an incentive competition. You could put up a cash prize and a timeline. Say, a cash prize for the first team within whatever, a 2-year window, a 5-year window, to invent a car brake pad that didn't have these certain negative consequences of normal brake pads, and to do so in a manner that can be produced at or below the cost of current brake pads. So essentially what I'm describing is like, it's an X prize. It's like the X prize that was offered for the first private firm that could launch a spacecraft into low orbit and land it again and do it again within 2 weeks or whatever it was. So we'd be prioritising actions like that incentivised people who actually knew what the heck was going on with the problem to solve the problem. And the thing is, in case this sounds wishy-washy to people, I wonder whether there might be a hint of this, we don't know this for sure, but emerging in some of our more recent stormwater modelling in southeast Queensland, because we had an Ideanthro episode not too long ago with Andy Hornbuckle and Darren Draper talking about some recent research that shows that compared to research from 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on, 10 to 15 years ago that we based our stormwater treatment objectives on it seems like the catchments of southeast Queensland are generating less nitrogen, sediment and phosphorus than we thought they were. And so there could be a few reasons. That could be different catchment types, could be different all sorts of things. But one idea that's been put forward is that in that time, a few interesting things have happened, but one of them is that practices with respect to dog poo have changed a lot. So you go back 15 or 20 years in Australia, the concept, like a dog, if your dog pooed while out walking, you just left it there and moved on. But today it's like completely socially unacceptable to walk your dog without a plastic bag to pick up its poo.
Yep.
Those are the sorts of actions that I can't tell you whether that's why there's less nitrogen being picked up in this more recent monitoring or not. But it's a hint that things like that might actually be able to have a tangible effect. And that's something that if you went back 20 years and told people that literally everyone walking a dog would probably have a dog poo in a plastic bag in their pocket, they'd have told you they were nuts. And yet it still happened.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I would say that definitely that's one of the large reasons why those levels have gone down over time. I mean, it's really just another form of source control.
Yeah.
Because only you're doing it through behavior change on how we act on the land, and it's just controlling another source of pollution. And maybe that's what we would prioritize, or what are the sources of these pollutants that we're trying to control. And you would do it either through, a legislative action like the brake pads, or a behavior change, and use a method like social marketing.
Yep. Yeah, I like it. This is interesting. Okay, I love where this conversation's run, but I'm conscious that we've been talking for quite a while. Should we start to wrap this up? Because we did say, we'll talk for like 20 minutes or something, and I assume we are far past that right now.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, so it's all good. So, any closing thoughts from your part? This conversation started with working across jurisdictional boundaries, but we've gone through.
And then we solved stormwater as a problem.
I've really enjoyed this chat. I feel that this really clicked into some spots that I didn't expect this to go, and that's I like these sorts of conversations because it's when we make these sorts of new connections and new ideas start to form up that I feel that we make progress on things. So I've really enjoyed where this chat's gone, even though I didn't see it quite going there in the first instance.
Yeah, no, I agree. I appreciate where this went well. And sometimes I accuse myself of being too much of a high-level thinker, or not high level, but too, high in the sky, or at a 10,000 foot level, as the saying goes.
Yep. And
not concrete enough.
Yeah, not thinking with enough. I'm going to see if you pick up on this. Not thinking with enough impeccable logic.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's a little in joke between Blair and I. Okay.
Jack Mullally, impeccable logic.
Yeah. Yeah. Blair used to somehow, back when we were both doing stuff with Healthy Waterways, Blair used to somehow insult me by saying my logic was impeccable. Somehow by telling me that my logic was impeccable, that was being levelled at me as an insult.
I don't know if it was as much an insult as just poking fun.
Yeah. No, it's all good. It clearly hasn't scarred me. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's wrap things up there. Thank you for taking the time to have a chat. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, let me know how this goes. Let me know if you guys make progress, if you manage to start this cross jurisdictional stuff happening. I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, funny thing. The reason that our Green Duwamish, I'm getting ahead of myself. The reason that the Green Duwamish watershed was, as you say, at the front of my mind in this context of working across jurisdictional boundaries is because actually on Wednesday we're having a meeting to talk about forming what we're terming a coalition around stormwater management actions among the jurisdictions in the Green Duwamish watershed, and we're calling the effort Our Green Duwamish.
Yeah, wicked. Cool. I like it. Well, yeah, it's certainly topical and front of mind, and obviously because I record these episodes but they don't get released straight away, then by the time anyone's watching this, that meeting will have happened. So hopefully I'll
probably have some things to share on that.
Yeah, wicked. Okay, let's wrap it up there. Blair, thank you for taking the time to have a chat. Everyone who's listened to this, thank you as always for listening in, and we will see you next time.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro, improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.